Okay, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Amy. And I'm now going to pass on to our second speaker, who is Elvis Coimbra Gomes. Elvis is completing a PhD in linguistics at Queen Mary University of London. He's interested in the triangulation of ethnography with corpus-assisted discourse analysis to uncover the ways language constructs experiences of mental health, and he's especially interested in obsessive-compulsive disorder alongside gender and sexuality. So Elvis has pre-recorded his talk, so I'm going to be playing it from where I am. So I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. Okay, so I'm just going to play this for you now. Elvis is here, by the way, so he will be answering questions at the end.
Okay, so today I'm going to present some of my results from my PhD project, which basically looked at how people who suffer from obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD, use language and orient towards certain ideologies of gender and sexuality to construct a pure heterosexual identity. So what is OCD? Basically, OCD is an anxiety and belief disorder that affects up to 2% of the general population. And when people think of OCD, they stereotypically associate OCD with these kinds of behaviors that you're seeing on your screen right now. But actually, OCD is a heterogeneous disorder that produces a pathological doubt about any topic that has an emotional, moral, and religious significance. As such, OCD sufferers, they can obsess about harming oneself or others. They can obsess about being blasphemous, about scrupulosity, about their romantic relationships, where they're obsessed whether they are truly in love with their partners or not, and the topic of this presentation about sexual identity. So in the case of this sexual orientation obsessive-compulsive disorder, people are constantly doubting their sexual identity. And psychologists think that there are 12% of heterosexual OCD sufferers that have this kind of OCD. And while there are LGBT people who have this kind of OCD as well, there is currently no data or studies on this population. And basically my study is the first one who also included LGBT groups in the analysis of the data. But for today's discussion, I will only focus on the heterosexual people in my study. So in OCD, everything starts with an obsessive unwanted thought that produces a lot of anxiety and doubt. And this thought is called Ecodystonic, which means that the content of the thought doesn't align with the self-view and values of the affected person. So in sexual orientation OCD, the kinds of thoughts can be about fears of becoming another identity or secretly being in denial, fears that one's sexual attraction is changing, or that other people might identify us as another sexual identity, or also that fears about that the issues in our relationships, romantic relationships, are potentially problematic for our own sexual orientation, and that having these kinds of intrusive thoughts will also interfere with our sexual performance, and then these are all signs of us not being the sexual identity we identify as. And then in order to reduce the anxiety and doubt that the unwanted thoughts produce, people with OCD, they will do what we call compulsions. And these are basically the following. So basically reassurance seeking, asking or confessing to people that one might not be the identity that they think they are. Checking for sexual arousal and attraction when watching any kinds of pornography or observing other people. Avoiding any kinds of anxiety triggers that might cause those thoughts to emerge, such as being around with friends, watching movies, or going to certain places. And also other types of mental compulsions, such as reviewing past sexual experiences, mentally repeating certain words and phrases, imagining erotic scenarios to check whether one is still the identity one identifies as, and also trying to suppress the unwanted thoughts. And by doing these compulsions, it actually creates temporary relief, but only for a short amount of time, because by doing the compulsions, people with OCD also create more obsessive unwanted thoughts and anxiety and doubt, which then they really entrap themselves in this vicious cycle of obsessive thinking. So where is the problem? Basically, psychologists, when they are looking at sociocultural factors that influence OCD, they use quantitative approaches. And what they do basically is they correlate prevalence rates of OCD types with certain social groups and geographical areas, and then they assume the most straightforward sociocultural cause without really knowing if sufferers do make that link. So for instance, psychologists have found that OCD sufferers with obsessions about blasphemy only occur, or rather mostly occur, in people who are very religious. Or another study found that in China there's a prevalence of order and symmetry obsessions, and then they said, well, that makes sense because in China Confucianism puts emphasis on social order, so people with OCD, they're reproducing that with their obsessions. And then another study in Brazil found that there was a prevalence of violent obsessions, and then they said, well, that also makes sense because in Brazil there is an increase in criminality, and people with OCD, they are responding to that. But the thing is, they established those conclusions without actually knowing if people do make these links with these social factors. And since the content of the obsessions, they all deal with some sort of social norms that govern society, I suggest that we should use ethnographic and discourse-based approaches to explore how normativity is negotiated in OCD sufferers' construction of identity. And that's basically what I did for my PhD project. So for the theoretical framework, I'm rooting my project in queer linguistics that considers gender, sexuality, and identity as performative effects of discourse that basically reiterate the ideologies of a regulatory frame that Judith Butler has called the heterosexual matrix. So basically, that in order to be heterosexual, people have to perform the gender that fits to their biological sex and desire the opposite sex. And then these norms are taken as ideals that people orient to. And linguists have repeatedly shown that normativity is materialized in discourse, for instance, through adverbs of frequency, like never and always or sometimes. And discourse here has to be understood as practices that systematically form the objects of which they speak. So it's a very Foucauldian approach to discourse that considers discourses basically as shared understandings of how to behave, to think, to feel, that emerges from certain power knowledge relations between institutions and the population. And in order to identify those discourses, we really have to interpret them. So there is not really an objective way to do that kind of analysis, but we can identify them by looking at the linguistic traces that index the discursive effects of those normative ideologies. So the way that I collect my data was through an online forum that I built, and I welcomed people who experienced sexual orientation OCD. And then I conducted an 18-month-long online ethnography between October 2019 and May 2020. And at the end, my full corpus is around 343,000 words written by 70 participants. And the majority of participants, as you see here, are heterosexual. And today, again, I will focus on this group. In order to analyze my data, I actually decided to triangulate ethnographic observations with corpus-assisted discourse analysis due to the large amount of data and its electronic nature. So I used the software Langsbox, and basically my ethnographic observations, they were really useful when interpreting the data for normative orientations, and also to select analytical entry points. So I didn't do a keyword analysis to enter my data. I really used my ethnographic observations in order to select certain words. So what I did is I identified 3 different topics where normativity played a huge role. So these were when participants were discussing topics related to sexuality, to certain gendered social actors, and their therapy. And then in order to remove some of the bias in the analysis, I selected the top 4 to 5 words that were most often used by participants, right? So it's really ranked by dispersion and not only frequency of the terms. And these are the words that I looked at in my thesis. And today I will especially look at the topic of sexuality and some of the norms that really emerge from this topic. An additional step in my analysis is that I did a collocation analysis. A collocation or a collocates are words that significantly co-occur near to each other. And these word associations, they may reveal connotations and ideological assumptions that are very important for my study. So I used the log ratio effect size metric with a cutoff score of 3 and a collocational window of 5 words to each side. And this really was set up in order for me to identify content words that collocated with my search terms. And then I focused on the top 30 collocates of the 14 search terms. So in total, I looked at 514 collocates. And we really have to understand that normative orientations are discursively materialized in judgments, evaluation, and stance taking. So I focused on the concept of discourse prosody, which is a co-occurrence relation in lexicosemantic units that is constituted by the relation between a word and units of meaning. And this basically revealed the evaluative polarity of the search terms that I selected. And only looking at the simple list of collocates doesn't really reveal any like normative orientations. So I had to extensively read concordance lines, and I did in my PhD project read around 8,600 lines to track the evaluation and how participants constructed their identity by drawing on certain normative discourses of gender and sexuality. So let's start with some of my data. So here I'm going to show you how heterosexual participants were trying to orient towards extreme forms of heteronormativity. And this was mostly revealed by the collocation of gay with the words must, mean, and proof. So the kinds of discourses that emerged was that heterosexual men, they have to be romantically and sexually successful with women, because if they fail to do that, then that means they are gay, and it caused them a lot of anxiety. Another discourse that emerged was that heterosexual people, they cannot evaluate the same sex positively or explore their sexuality with the same sex, because then that would mean that they are gay. They also have to fully avoid any practices or signs that could index gayness, such as saying certain words, having certain thoughts, imagining certain people or characters, enjoying certain colors or clothes that might not align with their gender, having certain postures that doesn't align with their gender, and even showing support for LGBT groups. So if they do these kinds of things, basically, it means that they are gay, and it caused them a lot of anxiety. Heterosexual people were also afraid of homosocial relations, especially men. There was like this fear that by being close friends with other men, that then that would mean that they are gay. And interestingly, some men also were afraid of heterosocial relations. So like they couldn't be friends with women because that would put them in the subject position of the best gay friend that women can have. So these examples basically are the conclusions that the participants make out of their obsessions, and we really see that their obsessions are shaped by heteronormative ideologies. And as you can see here, most of them were men. And I knew from my ethnography that women also oriented towards similar discourses. So I basically looked at the cluster must be a lesbian to show you some of the examples of how women oriented to the similar discourses of heteronormativity. So for instance, heterosexual women, they cannot evaluate other women positively because otherwise they think that that makes them lesbian. Heterosexual women, they cannot do anything that is related to masculinity. Heterosexual women, they need to have a straight mind. So like they really want to have a mind that is 100% heterosexual. So they cannot think anything about homosexuality. Heterosexual women have to always want to have sex with men, and they can also not support LGBT groups. And finally, heterosexual women, they cannot feel anything for another woman. So they cannot evaluate other women positively, they cannot feel friendship for other women, they cannot find other women, you know, attractive, nothing of that, because that means that they would be lesbian if they do these things. So basically what I also argue here is that the modal verb must not only hedges the epistemic stance of the participants in relation to their questioning of their sexuality, but I argue that it clearly expresses the strong deontic stance of the normative expectations. So basically the heterosexual participants, they need to fully align with the heterosexual matrix that Butler theorized, and any deviation results in the anxiety and thinking that they are gay. So now another finding where there was an assumption that heterosexuality is an unquestionable form of sexuality, and this really emerged with by looking at the collocates that sexuality had with question, doubt, and confident. And these collocates basically indexed how participants questioned their sexuality. And what we can see here is that the participants really constructed their past as one filled with full certainty of their heterosexuality. So they used positive evaluations of their heterosexual desire with the verbs loved, have been attracted to girls, I consider myself straight, I enjoyed a lot of heterosexual sex, and so forth. And then this positive evaluation is reinforced with the adverbs always and still. They also claimed confidence in the past tense through affirmatives. So here we have, I felt confident in my own sexuality. I was still extremely confident. I have always been confident. And then also this confidence is further constructed with the negation of the questioning with the adverbs never, not, and no. And what is interesting is that when I compared the cluster question my sexuality in the LGBT subcorpus, it only occurred 4 times, but it never ever occurred with any adverbs denying the questioning. And that makes sense because LGBT people, they have to go through a phase of questioning their identity in order to be LGBT. So basically this shows that heterosexual participants put an emphasis on negating the questioning, which then reveals a cultural assumption that heterosexuality is the original sexuality that should be immune to any sort of scrutiny. So in order to maintain a pure heterosexual identity, participants, they completely have to distance from any sort of questioning of their sexuality. So to conclude everything, I showed you that participants' obsessions are shaped by extreme heteronormative understandings of gender and sexuality that reflect Butler's heterosexual matrix. So any deviation from the gender and sexual norms generates a lot of anxiety in participants. They thus need to always distance from anything that might index gayness. And I would argue that these orientations towards these norms, they do not really construct their identity, their heterosexual identity as they are, but it's more an idealized form, an idealized pure self that they want to embody. And I would argue that this idealized pure self might be part of the problem in OCD, because usually psychologists, they focus mostly on like the feared self construct. That is the kind of identity that people with OCD are afraid to become. Whereas here I'm really saying that they should maybe also focus on the versions of themselves that they are constantly idealizing to become. And basically at the end, the findings really reflect the strong hegemonic status of heteronormativity. And what is interesting is that in my analysis, I also found that LGBTQ people, they also orient towards heteronormative understandings of what it means to be LGBT. So yeah, so that was it. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask them. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Elvis.
Okay, thank you, Elvis.
Lots of applause again.
Okay, lovely. So with that, shall we open up the floor to questions? I can see some people nodding along to the analysis in the chat. Any questions? Feel free to type in the chat or raise your hand if you just want to ask it straight off the bat. What? Oh.
We could start with one of us if people are thinking still.
Yeah. Do you want to go? Because I've got one that we could use as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
After you then.
Thank you, Elvis. That's so interesting. I think there's your work has relevance in so many areas. It's really fascinating. So yeah, I guess I was struck by a parallel between your presentation and Amy's presentation, where you had the keywords and both of you had this kind of very binary representation of sexuality, but yours particularly so. I wondered if this kind of very binary representation of gay or straight, lesbian or straight, was something that was kind of uniform across your corpus, and kind of what you think about that. Where's bisexuality? Why is it not there? Or kind of pansexuality or anything that's beyond that binary?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. Yeah, so this binary thinking was extremely present in my data for sure. The way that I interpreted that in my thesis was that binary thinking provides a very simplified view of the world, like not only politically, but also like how people make sense of the world, right? So it's either this or that, and it's a third option is just not possible because that's just too complicated. So people with OCD, they really are looking for a lot of order. They want to have an ordered view of the world because they are constantly doubting everything. So the extreme order is basically a countermeasure against the constant doubt that they are experiencing. So my bisexual participants, which was very interesting, is that they didn't, so like the gay participants and the heterosexual participants, they mostly oriented towards gender norms, right? So like a heterosexual participants, they could only perform their own gender performances. So like men doing masculinity, women doing femininity to be heterosexual. Gay and lesbian participants, they had to do the opposite. So a gay man had to do femininity to be gay, and a lesbian had to do masculinity to be a lesbian. But since bisexuality in our culture is not necessarily intelligible in terms of gender, my participants, my bisexual participants, they really oriented towards this bizarre ideal that they had to have sex with both genders at the same time, and that they had to be attracted to anybody at the same time. Because if they failed to do so, then that meant that they weren't really bisexual. And this is really like something that it's impossible to do. Like, I mean, like nobody is like constantly attracted to anybody that they're seeing, right? And this is really where the pathological nature of the OCD came forward. I also had an asexual participant who like couldn't feel sexual towards anybody, because then that would cause a lot of anxiety. I also had cisgender participants who were afraid of being trans, and also transgender participants who were afraid of being cisgender. So it was really like, you know, the either or, but nothing in between.
That's so interesting. Thank you, Elvis.
Thank you.
That really is. Thank you, Elvis. Before we go on to Laura, I have one question as well, and that's just whether or not you would mind speaking a little bit about the logistics behind not only setting up your own website for people with SOOCD, but also, you know, gathering this data, passing that ethical approval, because surely there has to be a lot of work behind that as well, right?
Yeah, it was a nightmare, to be honest. So I did spend a full year fighting for my ethical approval, because, I mean, obviously, like if I'm setting up a forum for a group of people who are deemed to be, you know, extremely sensitive group of the population, there had to be like very a lot of safety measures in place, and then there was also like a misunderstanding with the ethics committee when I said that maybe I would have participants with intrusive thoughts about being pedophiles. And I really felt misunderstood, because I just mentioned the word pedophile once in the application, and then for them that was really like a red flag, and they misunderstood my whole project. And then eventually I had to ask 3 different OCD specialists for support letters. I had to do a forum moderation training course in order to learn how to deal with sensitive data. And then the ethnography went pretty well. So like at the beginning, I was hoping that they would form a community by themselves, but then that didn't happen. So they were expecting me to ask them questions all the time. And I think that's because the forum was set up for research purposes and not just for a recreational thing. So like in my thesis, I have like this nice graph where you see the amount of messages that they posted compared to my messages. And you really saw that the 2 curves were following each other. So like the more I participated, the more they would participate. So at the very end, like I had mostly done interviews, and the amount of data that I have of them interacting with each other is really minimal.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we have a lovely question from Laura.
Yeah, hi Elvis. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. That was brilliant. Yeah, I just wondered if you were planning on, you know, trying to engage with health professionals or, you know, professional psychologists to kind of, you know.
Could you repeat that? Because like my internet connection got cut.
Oh, sorry. It might be mine as well. I think my husband's on some calls downstairs. No, I was just wondering if you were planning on trying to, you know, get some kind of impact out of your research by engaging with health professionals and saying, look what I found about the relationship between OCD and sexuality. You know, this how can, because I can see that this could be massively useful. So I just wondered if you had any plans in that area.
Yeah. So I'm thinking of, so like I personally experience that kind of OCD, so I've been extremely public about it. I've done podcasts. In Switzerland, I did some interviews, and now here, like I would like to, you know, get it out there, especially the results about the LGBT community. Because up until now, because most of this, well, all of the studies done about this kind of OCD were done on heterosexual people, it creates like this idea that we are pathologizing against homosexuality.
Yeah.
So like, you know, and my data definitely shows that, you know, it's not a thing, like the problem is not sexuality per se.
Yeah.
The problem is really the thinking patterns that are attached to the content of sexuality.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, I think it is really important that therapists become aware that it also affects LGBTQ plus people.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And do you think that it also, sorry to just jump in there with another one.
No,
It's very
no. Please feel free.
Very sneaky of me. Do you think that it kind of indicates just how ingrained the heterosexual matrix is? And you know, do you think that there is a kind of societal link? You know, that sexuality is just so often treated in this really kind of binary way. And does that have some relationship to why some people with OCD might?
Yeah, so I think, I think you're right. I think it's just like, you know, this very hegemonic way of understanding sexuality that we now have that is extremely based on identity. So like, you know, this strong impulse to perform this pure identity that is always and only aligning with the gender norms that constitute your identity is something that is really prevailing in contemporary society. So like, you know, the work done by Lucy Jones recently about transnormativity goes into that direction as well. So I think it goes more into that direction, that there is like this strong imperative to think about identity in essentializing terms.
Yes.
And for somebody who is constantly doubting their identity, because the doubt fluidifies identity, right? And since the doubt is the source of the anxiety, they go the opposite way to essentialize that anxiety as much as possible, to reduce that doubt and the anxiety, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. That was so interesting. Thank you.
Perfect question. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you for the questions, Laura. So really got time for probably one more. So that'll probably be from Mark. Mark, would you like to unmute yourself, or would you like me to read it out for you?
Hey, Elvis.
Mark.
Thank you so much. This is actually very similar to Laura's question, which was touching on this idea of culture, right? And so at the beginning, you were talking about how in other disciplines, they've connected cultural norms to what people obsess about, right? So like order to do with Confucianism in China, etc. So I had two questions. One was, where were your participants from? And then this kind of echoes what Laura was just asking about. Do you think that there's this sort of, I was trying to think of a way of putting it, and I just wrote hyper salience, like of sexual identity in Western culture. I'm assuming that they were mostly from Western countries, so to speak, that leads to or influences the prevalence of sexual orientation OCD. Do you think that there's some kind of connection there? But I think that you kind of sort of answered it, so you can kind of just answer the first one. Where were they from?
Yeah. So thank you. Yeah. Most of them were from Anglophone countries, so England, USA, Australia. I had also a large group from Europe generally, and only one from Saudi Arabia.
Interesting.
So I do think that there is a link in, you know, like those very essentializing discourses that we have about sexuality in the West, that if they get really present in other cultures, hypothetically speaking, we would also see like an emergence of those kinds of obsessions related to OCD. I mean, that's what I would hypothesize, that OCD is not necessarily about, you know, a very like, you know, moral thing about a culture, but it's more like, how does the culture and society deal with the norms? And then what is the power of the norm to define what is good or bad behavior? You know, so I think that is what generates the ground for anxiety to emerge in OCD.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that it's such important work because it really indexes like exactly what a lot of the norms and sort of hegemonic ideas that we have about gender and sexuality are. Really, really interesting. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you. And then finally, we don't have, it's not really a question, but Alex Crandall has put a really nice comment in the chat about how nice it is to see this work. I'm really hoping that it gets taken up and applied to therapeutic contexts.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
And so with that, it's just about time to pass back over to Jay to wrap this part of the seminar series up before we have a little break and move into the AGM.
Yes, so yeah, I just want to wrap up now. Perhaps we could just give one more quick round of applause to our fantastic speakers. Really, really great, really fascinating talks. And thank you to everybody as well for your interesting discussion and engagement. It's really great to see you all here. I guess I should also say a few other thanks. So thank you to Fraser, who's the co-organiser of this seminar series. And we're really hoping that even when we're back to face-to-face settings, that hopefully we'll be able to carry on doing something like this. Because it's been great to be able to get everyone together.